In this video, we're going to start documenting our server source code so that API Doc can generate the content for our API documentation website. The purpose of our documentation is to describe the endpoints of our API, including the URL, HTTP method, the request parameters required, the response to expect, and so on. Now, all this information will need to be specified in doc blocks in our source code. So where do we put those? Well, given the MVC structure of the PrintBay API, I think the best place for this info is in the router files. So you'll see I've already added a doc block above the line getItemController.fetch, which would provide documentation for the getItems endpoint. In case you haven't used doc blocks before, they're a type of comment that always begin with a double asterisk like this in order to distinguish them from regular comments. When our API doc grunt task runs, it will scan through our router files and it will pass any line in the doc blocks which begin with a valid API doc param. Now, an API doc param is this special tag that you see at the beginning of the line here. Now, you'll learn many different API doc params over the next few videos, but the one we'll always begin with is this one, which is simply just @API. Now, very similar to the way methods work in code, you need to place a certain sequence of values after an API doc param in order to use it correctly. So the first value after the param is the API method, which goes in curly braces. This should be the HTTP verb used by the endpoint that you're documenting. So this is a get route, and that's why I've put get here in curly braces. The second value is the path of the endpoint, which in this case is going to be items. And finally, we can put an optional description of the endpoint, which in this case is fetch all items. So coming over to the browser, you'll see how API Doc has used that information to partially document the endpoint, which we can see here. Now we're going to add several more API Doc params to complete this documentation. The next param we're going to add is API group. This defines the group to which the endpoint belongs. Now, the PrintBay API currently has two resource types, items and users. So we'll simply use item as the group for this endpoint, as we will for all the endpoints in this item router file. Now that we've added a group, you'll see that the endpoint is now properly grouped under this subheading item. As we start adding more endpoints, they'll all be logically grouped in this way. The next param we're going to add is API name, which allows us to provide a unique name for the endpoint. Now, technically, this can be anything you like, but the best practice is to use the format method plus path in Pascal case. So let's give this one the name get items. The main purpose of the name param is to give a unique anchor ID to the endpoint in the generated docs. So if we click the name of our endpoint in the sidebar, then you'll see the name has been used in the path. If I go up here and scroll along, there it is. Now this is handy because it allows you to hyperlink to this specific endpoint when the docs get deployed.